usar el YouTube, ¿verdad?
Yeah. Okay. We'll start now.
Yeah. So we can start now, right? Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last conference day and on food systems and long-term economic transformation organized by Southern Voice. This webinar is led by IPS Sri Lanka Institute of Policy Studies, Sri Lanka, on the theme of transforming food systems to evidence-informed policy responses. We ask two basic questions. One is, how can we ensure food security in the global south through food system transformation, especially with this pandemic situation? And we ask how to find solutions for an equitable recovery from the pandemic. This is an important topic, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic revealed key challenges in our food systems. They are, one thing is that the challenge in provision of sufficient nutritious food to vulnerable populations. The other thing is that ensuring livelihood for those working in the food systems. Actually, due to mobility restrictions, these livelihoods are affected, and most of the time they are rural poor people, so there are huge policy implications in this aspect. So food systems in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the global south, are particularly vulnerable to this health shock. As if you look at some numbers, the global report on food crisis 2021 revealed that COVID-19 induced economic contraction has become a major driver of acute food insecurity. In this session, the panelists will discuss the challenges and desirable policy options to ensure food security in the global south through food systems transformation. And also they will discuss how to find solutions to make equitable recovery from the pandemic. Given that introduction to the session, I'm Asanka Wijesinghe. I work at the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. I moderate this session. Let me briefly introduce you to the panelists. Give me a minute. Our first panelist is Dr. Ricardo Fort. Dr. Fort is an economist with a master's in applied economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he has a PhD in economic development from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. He is currently a senior researcher at the Group for the Analysis of Development, or GRADE, where he works on projects related to the economic development of rural areas, as well as marginal urban neighborhoods in Peru and in several other countries. In recent years, he has been visiting research at the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands and the University of Chicago in the US. He is a author of several books and academic articles on these subjects, and has worked as a consultant for reputed international institutions such as World Bank and the US and the United Nations. Dr. Puspa Sharma is our second panelist. He is the executive director of South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, a think tank based in Kathmandu, Nepal. He's also the editor-in-chief of organization's flagship Trade Insight. He has more than 16 years of experience in policy research and advocacy on trade and development issues. His writings have appeared in several publications in the form of research reports, book chapters, policy briefs, briefing papers, and peer-reviewed articles in established journals. Dr. Sharma is a member of the International Advisory Network for the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the Sustainable Development Goals, and International Advisory Network initiative at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. He earned his PhD in public policy from the Crawford School in Public Policy, the Australian National University. He also holds an MA in economics from Tribhuvan University, Kathmandu, and an MA in Global Finance, Trade and Economic Integration from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, University of Denver, Colorado. He is an alumnus of prestigious Fulbright program and the Australia Awards program. The third panelist is Dr. Berber Kramer. She is a senior research fellow with the International Food Policy Research Institute and currently outposted to Nairobi, Kenya. Her research focuses on financial inclusion and resilience, and in particular on innovations in agricultural insurance and seed systems that can help smallholder farmers adapt to climate change. She leads a research program that aims to strengthen agricultural insurance and finance in Ethiopia, India, and Kenya through picture-based crop insurance, using smartphone images of targeted crops to monitor crop health and management. In other projects, she uses high-frequency panel data and laboratory-based field experiments to analyze health and financial decision-making in rural households, the role of polygamy and trust between actors in agricultural value chains. She's the editor-in-chief for the social science section of development engineering. Dr. Kramer joined IFPRI in 2013 and has a PhD in economics from Tinbergen Institute in the Netherlands. The fourth panelist is Dr. Maria Ignacia Fernandez Gatica. She is a principal investigator at the Latin American Center for Rural Development. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Barcelona. She also holds a master's in political science from the University of Chile. She is attached to the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile as a sociologist. Dr. Maria's specialty topics include public policies, territorial development, decentralization, and social protection. Her work has been published in several international journals, books, book chapters, and reports. The fifth panelist is Dr. Manoj Thibbotuwawa. He is a research fellow and head of agricultural economic policy research at the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. He has 15 years of research experience, and his research interests are on the fields of agriculture, food security, environmental and natural resource economics. Manoj holds a BSc Agriculture with honors from the University of Peru, a master's degree in agricultural economics from the Postgraduate Institute of Agriculture at the University of Peru, and a PhD from the University of Western Australia. He also obtained a postgraduate diploma in modeling and accounting for sustainable development from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. Manoj is a recipient of the prestigious Nafik Fellowship from the government of the Netherlands and Endeavour Award from the government of Australia. So that's his introduction to our panelists. And some information about the session logistics is that we are live streaming in YouTube. You can post a question in YouTube or either Twitter. Also, there is a question and answer chat box. You can see that you can post your questions to them. Initially, we will have 2 rounds of discussion with 4 minutes for each panelist, and then we will have a question and answer session. first, let me start the session with Dr. Berber. My question to you, Dr. Berber is that since early 2020, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic shock, the governments have enforced a lot of measures to curb the virus spread. Major measure is actually the mobility restrictions, and especially national lockdowns, which affected the commercial and industrial activity, and also ban on movement of people, which had a severe implication on the food systems. Based on your research experience, especially in the developing countries, how do you see the impact of national lockdown on smallholder farmers' income and food security? Because even in Sri Lanka, we are hearing that there are a lot of disruptions to supply chains and also the farming activity. So mostly these are rural farmers, and their income as well as food security is impacted. So how do you see the impact of national lockdowns on the smallholder farmers' income and food security?
Right. Thank you so much for this question. We were actually in the middle of launching a large number of surveys in different countries when the lockdown started, and had to shift to phone surveys, and decided to actually ask farmers how the lockdown was impacting them. And we got a lot of responses. It was not negligible. The lockdown had severe impacts on different areas of people's lives. We found, for instance, farmers reporting that they were not able to access labor, or that labor had become a lot more expensive. We found reports of farmers saying that they couldn't sell their crops anymore in the markets, or that prices were really low and they were depending on traders to come to the farm gate to procure their crops. We also found that farmers were reporting worsening of food security. So consumption, or especially dietary diversity, was deteriorating. But the key thing that stood out to me was this was really varying across contexts. And we found very different responses, for instance, in Odisha, in India versus in Haryana, which is in Northwest India, versus what farmers were telling us in Kenya. So we found very diverse responses across the different contexts where we are working. And what we found is, even if you're focusing on within a state, so within Haryana, we had a comparison of tomato and wheat farmers, and even there we found really large differences in terms of wheat farmers suffering significantly less the consequences than tomato farmers. And so there's a lot of heterogeneity, and I don't know if we have time later, we can talk a little bit more about what does this mean, these differences across contexts, in terms of, what are the policy measures that can help protect farmers from future lockdowns. So that's something I think that we can talk more about later.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Berber. Let me ask the next question from Dr. Sharma. There is this important concept, food sovereignty, and not only it is at the conceptual level, we see that it is included into the Nepal constitution. My question is, can you briefly tell us what is meant by this food sovereignty, and what factors affected, what factors motivated including it to the constitution, and whether there is an effect of that constitutional arrangement to perform for Nepal to perform better during the pandemic, given its adoption of the idea of this food sovereignty, and how has Nepal been doing on the food and agriculture front since this adoption of this concept of food sovereignty? So, Dr. Sharma.
Yeah, thank you, Asanka, for that question. Indeed, it's very interesting. Actually, when we talk about food systems transformation, perhaps the idea of food sovereignty is something that we should not ignore, because it is the idea that social movements actually all around the world now have been promoting. And the idea, I find it a bit ambiguous still. I think there is no a clear understanding or a clear interpretation of what food sovereignty actually entails. It all depends on how people perceive it, but there is something common among the social movements who have promoted this idea. Basically two things. One is the focus that now the world needs to go back to localized agriculture, to agroecological practices, against the industrial form of agriculture that has devastating impacts, right, on agriculture, on the climate and all this. So that's one. And the second one, actually, that the idea of food sovereignty, the promotes is the decision-making power to be given to farmers themselves. So this is what actually we learned from the food sovereignty movement, social movements. Now, in the case of Nepal, of course, it has been hailed as an example that Nepal has food sovereignty as a fundamental right in the constitution. First, it came in 2007 in the interim constitution, and then in the constitution that we have now in 2015, it was again carried out over there as a fundamental right. But what does this entail? It's not clear. And if we look at the agricultural policies, the food policies that Nepal has adopted, even since 2007, 2015, with the idea of food sovereignty, we don't find much of changes. And in some cases, actually, we find the reverse. Because in Nepal itself, we have many smallholder farmers doing agriculture, but because of a number of reasons, they are not able to do well. And there is huge migration from rural to urban and actually even abroad, people leaving agriculture. So we already have small-scale agriculture in place, but now the focus has been more on commercial kind of agriculture. I wouldn't say industrial as such, but commercial agriculture, because that has been taken as an idea that will ensure more food production and more food security. So in contrast to what the social movements have been promoting food sovereignty for, we kind of seem to go in the reverse. And during the pandemic, what we saw actually is that local farmers were suffering because vegetables were rotting in their fields, not reaching the markets because of lockdowns and disruptions. Only in a very few places where local governments, they were helping farmers, they were able to reach out to the markets. But on the other hand, as a food import dependent country, we had been importing food and there was no such disruption in terms of our imports. So we didn't see much of a change. So what we see is that food sovereignty has remained so much as a cosmetic kind of a thing in the constitution. But what really it entails, whether that really leads to food system transformation, is a question that needs to be posed, and perhaps we can come to this in the second round. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. My third question is to Dr. Ford. So you have been working with local actors in different cities in Latin America to seek solution for the pandemic. My question is, what has been, in your opinion, the value of local action to shield vulnerable groups from hunger through this COVID-19 pandemic? Could you share some key points with examples of local actors' interventions, especially in these countries, that can help the households to improve their food security? Especially who are these local actors, who are these important local actors in making efforts to shield households from this food insecurity?
Thank you, Asanka, for the question. As part of our IDRC project, we have been working in 3 cities in Latin America, in Lima, Quito, and La Paz, basically trying to understand the difficulties that most vulnerable urban households were facing to access food, and particularly fresh products since the beginning of the pandemic, and designing with local actors some interventions that can help these households improve the food security, but also local food vendors to economically recover from the crisis. Also, in that sense, we think that poor households in these cities had to face what we call a double side problem in terms of food access. On one side, a lot of them lost their main source of income based on informal commerce and other activities during the strict and long lockdowns that our countries imposed. And so many of them had to cut down on food consumption. We actually estimate that a 30% decrease in food expenditure in poor households in Lima, for example. And on the other side, one of the principal source of fresh and low-cost products for this household, for this population, are traditional food markets. Most of them are in the periphery of cities with semi-formal or even informal governance structures. And a lot of them had to close or limit their functioning because of these long lockdowns, mobility restrictions, and also at the same time because of the infrastructure that they have and the agglomeration that is around them, they become a center of contagion. So to address the value of local action, I want to focus on one of the main results of this food crisis for poor households in Lima. Actually, what happened is that women in these periphery neighbors started to organize themselves and create what we call ollas comunes, that are common pots, a spontaneous organization of households to jointly find food and cook together for the neighborhood. So every day we saw more and more of these organizations that didn't get any help from the government, as they were not formally recognized and the law didn't allow to transfer resources to them. And many of them were composed by informal workers that were not registered for government bonus or support like monetary transfers. So we start to work on a strategy with local actors, first to locate and collect basic information of these common pots in order to design an intervention to help them access to food, cooking implements, and basic organizational training. So the first step was to make them visible to authorities, and that was the key. Once we did that, we tried to work with the national government, with the Ministry of Social Inclusion, but there was a big political crisis in Peru at that time, so we turned to the municipality of Lima and create a geospatial database with basic information for these common pots, and we found more than 3,000 in Lima, beneficiating more than 200,000 families. So making visible the invisible was key, and with that information, later on, we could turn to the national government, and actually we helped them create a zero hunger program at the national level, and organize these common pots with the help of local authorities to get access directly from food baskets or even small farmers, and try to respond to their needs.
Okay, Dr. Ford, thank you very much. I'm the fourth panelist is Dr. Maria. Dr. Maria, the COVID-19 pandemic has had severe implications on households' food security in terms of physical and economic access. We can see that one thing is that there are supply shortages, and also livelihoods are affected, prices are increased, so economic access has become an issue to this, especially the access to sufficient healthy food, especially in the developing countries. So based on your research in Latin America, could you briefly explain the strategies that households are using to cope the food security impacts of COVID-19? how do they mitigate these accessibility issues, especially physical and economic access?
Okay, thank you very much, Asanka, for your question. I would like to take advantage of to make my comments in Spanish, just to be sure.
Sure.
Ok, bueno, para contestar, yo quisiera partir por comentar que los niveles de inseguridad alimentaria por los que atraviesa la región América Latina, nosotros estamos trabajando en 5 países, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala y México, en el marco de la pandemia son altísimos. Incluso llegamos a casos, como por ejemplo en Guatemala, con cerca del 60% de personas en inseguridad alimentaria y cerca del 30% con niveles de inseguridad alimentaria severa. Entonces, ante estos hallazgos, que son parte de un proceso, de una encuesta que hemos hecho en un par de territorios en cada uno de los 5 países que mencioné, fuimos un poco en la línea con la pregunta que nos hacía Asanka, a tratar de indagar en cuáles son las razones que están detrás de esta fuerte crisis e incapacidad de los hogares de alimentarse de forma adecuada. Lo primero que encontramos es que hay un porcentaje importante de hogares que han perdido perceptores de ingresos, así como otro porcentaje importante de hogares, mayor todavía, que pierde ingresos. La diferencia entre perceptores de ingresos y ingresos propiamente tal se explica por los altos niveles de informalidad que predominan en América Latina. Entonces, en el fondo, la pérdida de perceptores de ingresos tiene que ver con la pérdida de personas que tenían algún trabajo formal y dejan de tenerlo, que llega al 40% en el caso de algunos territorios. En los casos de México, por ejemplo, bordean entre el 35, el 40, lo mismo que en Guatemala, mientras que la pérdida de ingresos tiene que ver también con la importancia de la informalidad. Y ahí llegamos a cifras de el 70% incluso en algunos de los territorios donde estamos trabajando. Y así efectivamente lo que nos señalan los encuestados es que fundamentalmente las razones por las cuales no han podido asegurar su ingreso a los alimentos tienen que ver con que los ingresos no son suficientes, pero también muy fuertemente, con la excepción de Ecuador, con que los precios de los alimentos han subido demasiado. Y eso, algo hay también sobre distancia respecto de los puntos de venta, escasez de producción de alimentos, pero básicamente precios, alzas de precios, inflación importante en los distintos países. Entonces, en este escenario, en el fondo, las principales estrategias que han adoptado los hogares para responder a esta crisis, a esta falta de ingresos, han tenido que ver con cambios importantes en sus dietas alimentarias, así como en estrategias de endeudamiento o ventas de activos propios para poder solventar los gastos básicos en alimentación. Se gastan los ahorros, se reduce el consumo fuertemente de proteína animal, y así vemos que cerca de, no sé, un 80% de los hogares en promedio efectivamente hace cambios importantes en su dieta. ¿Cuáles son esos cambios? El principal, lamentablemente, es la reducción del consumo de carnes y pescados, con cifras que llegan en algunos de los territorios a cerca del 60% de los hogares que señalan hacer estas reducciones, seguida de la reducción del consumo de frutas y verduras frescas, y a cambio de eso un incremento importante de alimentos envasados, alimentos preparados, también cerca de un 30% en algunos territorios de incremento de ese tipo de alimentación de peor calidad. Así que bueno, lo dejo hasta aquí por ahora para que después podamos ir viendo cómo los gobiernos han ido aportando a resolver parte de estas dificultades, ¿no? Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Dr. Maria. The fifth panelist is Dr. Manoj Thibbotuwawa from the IPS. Dr. Manoj, we can say that the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the food systems and the importance of these food systems to withstand and recover from shocks. What is your evaluation about the local food system's resilience to these shocks? Are they resilient enough? Or if it is not, what are the reasons behind this lack of resilience? And what are the consequences for the countries with this vulnerable local food systems?
Okay, thank you, Asanka. If I start with briefing what is resilient, it's if a well-functioning food system or a resilient food system should be able to supply safe and healthy food in an inclusive and sustainable way. It also should deliver equitable distribution of costs as well as profits among its stakeholders. So basically, food system resilience is the capacity of food system to deliver desired outcomes. So those desired outcomes, as I explained, in the face of shocks. But shocks are not new to the world, because the COVID-19 crisis is just one shock that illustrates the importance of building resilient food system. This is not the first or the last. The world went through the global food crisis in 2008 that caused dramatic increases in global food prices and food shortages. Also, the world faces extreme climatic events like drought, floods, and also other shocks like conflict. So there are a lot of shocks happening. If I answer your question, there are several factors that affect the local food system's resilience. I can categorize them into 5 main gaps based on our research that we conducted with Southern Voice, where we looked at the impact of the pandemic on food value chains, especially focusing on rice and vegetable value chains. Those are the staple foods in Sri Lanka. Especially, this is very important because this is one of the first studies using field data, because the country was locked down for a longer period of time, so using phone interviews. So basically, those 5 gaps are technology, that is inadequate use of modern techniques and quality planting materials, and policy and governance. This is basically frequent policy changes without research-based evidence. I can take a classic example from Sri Lanka. Now the government banned chemical fertilizer recently with the aim of promoting organic fertilizer. But the agriculture of the country is not prepared for such a drastic changes. Now we can see the results of this policy issue. And also the other gap is institutional and coordination gap. So basically this explains the complex institutional architecture. In Sri Lanka, we have several government ministries and line agencies covering the different disciplines of agriculture, and they have a lack of coordination. For example, if I take research and extension, these two should go together, as it seems. So, but research is mainly done by the National Research Institute, but extension is a function of the provincial council. So there is a gap in this governance because of these hierarchical issues. And also the fourth gap is information gap. Information, especially we have our food channels are very lengthy, so farmers are poorly connected with markets. And also the fifth gap is finance and resources gap, especially lack of investment on research and development and infrastructure. So there are these main 5 gaps, and these 5 gaps contribute to various consequences in the food system, such as inefficient resource management by farmers, especially using irrigation water and fertilizer, and also high cost of production, low productivity, high post-harvest losses. So rural producers, because of these reasons, as well as because of the weaker bargaining positions, rural producers receive lower prices, while intermediaries gain undue advantage of this situation. Finally, the consumer also will have to suffer due to high prices. So this situation has been aggravated during COVID-19 pandemic, with several micro-level impacts, especially on labor mobility, inputs availability, input prices, output and output prices. I can give some example based on our field survey. Relative to the pre-pandemic situation, about 40% of the farmers had spent fewer number of days during the pandemic on their crop cultivation. Also, their use of higher labor is a little bit lower before the pre-pandemic situation. So also import restriction, especially implemented, resulted in shortages of goods like chemical fertilizer and high quality seeds. So in our survey, we could experience that a larger share of farmers planted less with less seeds, as well as they use less amount of fertilizer as well as agrochemicals because of this situation. Also, a relatively significant percentage of farmers had problems related to the price of different inputs as well as output price. They received a significant share of farmers received a relatively lower output price during the same period. So these results that we got from the field, in terms of consumer side, markets across Sri Lanka saw some price spikes for food commodities due to the logistical challenges posed by the pandemic and the lockdown, especially the food inflation, average about, I think it's around 11% during all 3 waves of the pandemic. We had 3 earlier waves, as opposed to about 6% overall inflation during the same period. So I can say that COVID-19 pandemic has impacted everyone's life in some way, but not the same way. Some people live in more vulnerable contexts than the others, and they have different level of response capacity, so they experience more profound impacts than the others. Similarly, if we compare the global countries, low and middle income countries, especially like those in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they have less advantage in facing shocks and crises. So these situations we have experienced in terms of food system resilience in the world. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj. Okay, we successfully concluded the first round of questions. Let's move to the second round of question. Then I will direct the questions we have from the audience. I see there are a couple of questions. After this round, I will direct those questions. So this question is to Dr. Berber. Doctor, do you see any difference in farmers' resilience when different farming systems, crops or geographical locations are considered? Whether these resilience strategies are varying as a function of these different farming system, crops or geographical locations? And as an extension to that question, what measures that you would suggest this minimizing differential impact, maybe to the policymakers?
Yeah, thank you. No, as I was already alluding to in my answer in the first round, is that we see stark differences, both across crops and across contexts. So one example is that in Odisha, we found that farmers they were really struggling selling their crops. And in Haryana, another state in India, we were focusing on a sample of wheat farmers, and these wheat farmers, they could access public procurement systems. So there were markets in place where they could take their wheat. And the Haryana state government did a really good job, I think, in saying, okay, we're going to implement social distancing, but the markets where farmers are selling their wheat, they are staying open. And so among these wheat farmers, we did not find any price disruptions. Farmers did not have to dump their wheat at really low prices. Whereas in Odisha, we saw that farmers really struggled getting rid of their crops and really had difficulties accessing the markets. And a lot of them took a loss on the price at which they sold their produce. Even within Haryana, we found that whereas these wheat farmers had access to markets to sell their crops, farmers in the same state who were tomato farmers, there's no central procurement system for tomatoes. So they still relied on the regular markets and could not actually sell their tomatoes in local markets. And as a result, they depended on intermediaries who could take their produce to markets that were still open. And that came with extra transportation costs, and they had to take losses.
No, that central procurement system, is that run by the government? Or?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is what they call the minimum support prices. And so that brings me to kind of policy implications. The minimum support prices can be, depending on who you talk to, be considered a bit controversial. So we are not saying on the basis of our findings, let's introduce a central procurement system run by the government combined with minimum support prices everywhere. But we are saying there needs to be a mechanism in order to improve resilience of farmers, and especially if we're anticipating future lockdowns, there need to be mechanisms that help farmers cope with this price risk, that all of a sudden something can happen, that prices plummet or that they cannot get rid of their produce, and how to cover that marketing risk. In the work that I and the team are doing at IFPRI, we are really focused so far, mainly on reducing production risk through crop insurance. But that doesn't help farmers when there is a shortfall in a drop in prices. So we're really looking for policies and programs that can help address that price risk. And there's different initiatives in this area ongoing now, but those are really important. And so that's one. Now in Kenya, we actually saw that farmers were experiencing another problem. And that was the markets were closed, the lockdowns were happening right at the time that they needed inputs. And so access to the inputs was the key constraint. So as we were working on an insurance program there, what we did is we said, okay, let's actually help bridge that gap and provide insurance combined with seeds. So now we started actually providing the inputs to farmers by bundling them with the insurance products that our local implementing partners were offering. So those are a few of the differences across contexts that we found, and different policy recommendations or types of interventions that could come out of that. But I think the price risk is really what really struck us. We saw that tomato farmers, they lost, compared to a normal season, about 50% of their tomato income just because prices fell so drastically.
Okay. Thank you very much. My next question is to Dr. Sharma. Dr. Sharma, what have been the roles of think tanks in disentangling the ambiguities in the idea of food sovereignty? Actually, this is a novel concept for us too. I think you can enlighten us in this area. And what do you think that think tanks should be doing in the days to come, especially in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, to disentangle the ambiguities in this idea of food sovereignty?
Thank you. Indeed, I don't see much happening in the area of food sovereignty that is being studied by think tanks as such, whereas it is important because what we see is there is a kind of a tussle between the social movement on the one side and governments, private sector perhaps on the other, because of the varied conceptions of how food and agricultural development should proceed. And we all know food is not is not something that we can talk only by taking agriculture into the picture. It's about economics. It is about politics, right? It's about the environment. It's about technical aspect. It's a host of many things interdisciplinary. So when the social movements are talking about localization of food production, about agroecology, how far can we go in this direction and ensure that there is enough food production, right, for the masses? And where is the balance? By local agriculture, what do we mean? Are we saying that it's about producing your own food for yourself, or how much of you can produce in this particular manner to also cater to the market for those who don't produce food enough? What do we do about food and agricultural trade? So these are very important issues. As Manoj was also alluding to, Sri Lanka's recent example of turning to organic agriculture, that is precisely what social movements on food sovereignty are calling for. So if we are to go into organic agriculture, and that is, I think, something that we see that is in demand now, also from consumers, what is the way out? Can that be abrupt? Perhaps not, as we saw in the case of Sri Lanka, right? That might have to be gradual, because our soil has been, turned into, taking this chemical fertilizer. They can't be turned perhaps overnight into organic forms. So what is the process of going forward in this? And does this sustain the food and agricultural systems and promote food security in the way that social movements have been saying? This is something I don't see much being studied by think tanks and academics. And because this is an interdisciplinary area, I think it is high time, also given the context of climate change and others, where the demand for food systems transformation has been, gaining momentum because of the, emissions and other negative aspects of, large-scale industrial agriculture promoted by multinational companies. It is high time, perhaps, that this interdisciplinary thing need to be studied by think tanks, and the policy direction need to be given. Otherwise, we see that the policy makers perhaps are in a state of flux. Like in Nepal, we have food sovereignty, but I think we don't know what to do. Whether we promote small farmers, we do both, and how to do about that. So there is, I think, a space that the think tanks need to take in and do more research, coming together, and then provide a policy direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Dr. Fort, the next question is for you. This is an important aspect because we hear that the importance of government involvement, policymakers' involvement in solving this food system-related problems, but we cannot forget the private sector involvement. That is very important given the fiscal constraint of the governments are facing, especially due to the contraction of economies because of the COVID-19. So according to your experience, what has been the role of the private sector in fostering or even innovating solutions in the food sectors in the countries of your research, especially the role of private sector in promoting e-commerce in traditional food markets during the pandemic and the challenges faced by the food systems?
Yes, thank you. As the previous colleagues have said, when trying to understand the problems that we face in the pandemic related to food systems, it's very important to understand the whole system, right? And all the components. And normally, we as researchers try to focus when looking at food systems and food security in the corners of the system, right? Either the producers or the consumers. But actually, as our colleague from IFPRI was mentioning, sometimes the markets in the middle, the food markets in the middle, are key to understand, to see what happened between this interaction in the two corners, right? So that's what we have been trying to focus on, and working, as I said, in traditional food markets in Quito, La Paz, and Lima. So we wanted to understand what were their difficulties to maintain their business during the pandemic and try to help them recover, no? And it's important to mention that this sector is always an orphan of public policy in these countries, right? No one helped them. There are some guidelines, sectoral guidelines that didn't cover them. There is national level, local level governments that try to help them, but there is no clear mandate on how to work with them. So we have been working in different interventions with the public sector, but actually the most immediate one came from an alliance that we made with the National Bank Association in Peru, local governments and market food vendors, right? So what we did is the following. Even when food markets were able to reopen, we found that many people were afraid to enter into these markets and buy food using cash as usual. As I mentioned before, these places were a concentration of people, a center of contagion. So we saw an opportunity with the banks to promote the use of digital money in food markets, which has been growing in our cities, but mostly in better off neighborhoods. So we designed a pilot with the representative of the 3 main digital wallet companies in Peru, the municipalities and market associations to promote the use of digital money in these settings. So currently we have implemented the intervention in 70 food markets in several cities in Peru, and we had an initial adoption rate of these digital wallets of around 20%, but the last week we did a new survey and we found a spillover effect to other vendors in this market that helped reach a 60% adoption rate around 3 months after the initial intervention. So it was very effective. And we found this as an opportunity to go even further. And now we are trying a digital sales platform. So we created an app where consumers can easily buy food from different vendors in the same food market and get their products delivered at home or ready to get them at the market entrance. So we are currently starting a pilot in 6 markets in 2 municipalities in Lima, and hope to develop similar interventions later on in Quito and La Paz.
Thank you, Dr. Fort. Next question is to Dr. Maria. Dr. Maria, the different governments responded differently in the COVID-19 pandemic. Even I'm interested in the trade policies too. I have seen that different governments, some governments wanted to make sure that the people have enough food, so they removed trade policy restrictions for food imports. But some governments impose trade policy restrictions. So we see this heterogeneity in government responses. So how do households perceive and value the type of responses they have received from their respective governments in the context of the COVID-19 crisis?
Sí, gracias, Asanka. Mira, lo primero que yo te señalaría al respecto es que una parte importante de los hogares en los países en los que hemos estado trabajando han recibido algún tipo de ayuda, ya sea alimentaria, o sea, en bienes, en especies, o de apoyo monetario. Pero ciertamente hay diferencias importantes entre algunos países donde esas ayudas son mucho más visibles y cuantificables en términos del aporte efectivo que realizan, respecto de otros países donde los hogares han tenido que recurrir mucho más bien a apoyos comunitarios, ¿no? Ayudas de vecinos, sus propias comunidades, etc. Lo que llama mucho la atención es que a pesar de, incluso en los países y en los territorios donde el nivel de ayudas es importante, justamente en aquellos hogares que presentan más carencias alimentarias, eso lo medimos por hogares donde hubo al menos una persona del hogar que estuvo un día completo sin comer, es donde se han recibido menos apoyos públicos. Entonces vemos ahí algunas dificultades importantes como de focalizar los apoyos respecto de los hogares que presentan mayores niveles de complejidad. Esto que estoy comentando fue sobre todo el primer año de la pandemia. La sensación que hemos ido recogiendo a través de entrevistas o conversaciones más cualitativas con los actores con los que estamos trabajando en los territorios, es que la percepción que ellos tienen del tipo de respuestas del Estado es de poca pertinencia, respecto de sus necesidades específicas, varios de quienes me han antecedido han hecho comentarios de alguna forma en la misma línea, desde la perspectiva, por ejemplo, de que al inicio de la pandemia teníamos la sensación de que los problemas iban a estar más bien por el lado del abastecimiento, ¿no? Del acceso a alimentos, pero más bien lo que vamos viendo es como en puntos intermedios de la cadena, como el acceso a canales de comercialización para los productores, o el tema que también se comentaba sobre los altos precios de los insumos, que muchas veces han terminado en productores que toman la decisión de directamente dejar de producir, mucha falta de apoyo técnico también de parte de los gobiernos, que hacen básicamente que el problema de la inseguridad alimentaria se vuelva un problema como en los múltiples eslabones de la cadena y no solamente en los extremos. Esto es fuertemente percibido por los productores, por los actores con los que hemos estado dialogando, ciertamente con diferencias importantes según el tipo de productores. Hay algunos que tienen una capacidad de resiliencia mayor respecto a estos temas, los que explotan producciones agroecológicas, los que tienen un poco más de capital y capacidad de inversión, que se encuentran más conectados, por ejemplo, y con más capacidades digitales, pero en términos generales la percepción mayoritaria es como de falta de apoyos importantes, y algo que para nosotros es muy central desde la perspectiva de una mirada territorial de las respuestas a la crisis, es la percepción generalizada de que las medidas han sido muy estandarizadas y que no responden a diferencias concretas en distintos territorios. Y pongo dos ejemplos para cerrar. Uno, por ejemplo, tiene que ver con las ayudas alimentarias directas, cajas de alimentos, por ejemplo, que no tienen ninguna pertinencia territorial, que no contribuyen a reactivar economías locales y que muchas veces son poco saludables o poco vinculadas a los consumos locales, digamos, lo que en determinadas locales se consume mayoritariamente. Y la otra, el tipo de medidas que se han tomado en contextos de confinamiento, que básicamente la percepción de la población rural es que han sido medidas diseñadas para territorios urbanos, donde los tiempos de desplazamiento son menores, donde las posibilidades de acceder a bienes y servicios están más cercanas, y por lo tanto los permisos de desplazamiento, los espacios de salir del confinamiento no responden a los contextos de la ruralidad. Esos son solo algunos ejemplos, ¿no? Pero de cómo esta percepción de que medidas que se toman a nivel nacional de carácter estandarizado no responden a diferencias de territorios específicos ni de la población rural en general, ciertamente.
Thank you, Dr. Maria. The last question of the second round is for Dr. Manoj Thibbotuwawa. Dr. Manoj, what positive innovations, changes would you highlight among response measures to COVID-19 crisis, considering the need to transition to sustainable food systems? The positive innovations you experience in this crisis.
Asanka, that is a very important question. I think talking about ways of improving food system resilience, I would like to, this is based on our experience, based on our field research that we conducted with Southern Noise. So I would like to highlight 4 factors that increase food system resilience. We call this is ABCD of food system resilience. This is a model, I think, adapted by Wijesinghe University. So A is agency, that is means and capacities of people to mitigate risk and to respond to shocks. That is basically the adaptive capacity of the people. And then the second one is buffering, creation and maintenance of subnational, national or regional food stocks. And C is connectivity, nature and strength of the interactions between the various components, and also the diversity at different scales and different places. So these 4 ABCDs can create food system resilience or increase the food system resilience. So when I lumped the recommendations or findings of our research into this framework. So basically, most important factor is in agency is timely availability of inputs. As I mentioned in my previous round, it was very serious concern during the COVID-19 pandemic period. So proper distribution of inputs, especially fertilizer, should be taken care by the authorities with appropriate measures to prevent misuse and overuse. Also, the other thing is we need to adapt technologies that require less use of chemical fertilizer, because as Dr. Puspa mentioned, now the world is moving towards organic agriculture. So we need to adapt technologies that require less use of chemical fertilizer so that we can promote the organic fertilizers. So gradual adoption of organic agriculture practices is the way forward. And also in terms of seeds, production of seeds need to be expanded, and public sector support in research and breeding programs is critical, because it's now it's declining. And also other two factors important are agriculture extension services and information dissemination. So especially that, as I mentioned, the coordination between agriculture sector organization is very poor. So focus should be on improving coordination and collaboration of programs. Also, I think earlier speakers also talked about that digital technology can be used in agriculture extension services. And also another factor that is important in agency is reviewing agriculture financing services. This is very important, providing concessional credit schemes and simple procedures in providing loan facilities for agriculture activities and agro-based industries. So this is one of the aspects of agency. And when we talk about the buffering, Sri Lanka needs to strengthen its storage capacity and maintain a buffer stocks of essential food items as a national food bank with some nodal points at the provincial council level. Also, this can be linked to the proposed SAG food bank as well. So this regional cooperation is also ensured. In terms of connectivity, this is very important because the demand for digital marketing platform increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this should be capitalized to promote the capacity of e-commerce at both ends of the food supply chain. So ICT platforms have already proven useful to some extent to increase the resilience of the food system, including those of farmers, traders, and consumers during the pandemic. Further, I think a mechanism need to be developed to help connect smallholders to the e-commerce platform, because usually smallholders in rural areas, they are not familiarized with these e-commerce applications. So in terms of to prevent only the elite capture the digital marketplace, we have to help connect smallholders, especially linking farm organizations with e-commerce or something like that will be considered. And another important thing is providing farm market linkages and monitoring. So by farm market linkages, it will establish transparency in pricing and better value, especially for perishable products. It could also help to increase farmers' income as well as enable other players to source more effectively by eliminating the intermediaries. And also a regular monitoring system can safeguard the local food supply from international trade restrictions as well as possible malpractices by local traders. In Sri Lanka, we recently experienced in the rice market because of the oligopolistic situation. Some of the large-scale millers are taking advantage, and we had a lot of problems with the rice prices. So a regular monitoring system can prevent most of these malpractices. And also in terms of diversity, I think diverse farm systems like mixed multi-crop farms and variety in farm type and sizes, these can enhance the availability of and consumption of diverse food by people needed for their healthy diet, and these can have greater capacity to absorb the effects of such shocks like COVID-19 pandemic. And also not only at the farm level, at the food processing level, also diversification is needed, because in the country like Sri Lanka, food processing has only concentrated to a few enterprises, and private involvement in food processing is very low, value addition is very low. So this can provide some form of food system resilience to face pandemic situations like COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj. We concluded the 2 rounds of questions, but I like to direct some questions from the audience. There is an important question from, I think this is Dr. Thibbotuwawa. It's about the technology, actually. It's related to what Manoj said. The question is, are we utilizing the full potential of technology in the delivery, distribution, and ensuring the food security for all? As an example, these online platforms for national food and agricultural marketing system during the pandemic, especially during the lockdown. According to your research experience, I would like to ask this question from all the panelists. Maybe take about 2 minutes to answer this. What is your experience, country level experience, and what are the bottlenecks in using this technology to improve the resilience of the food systems? I would like to start from Dr. Berber, Kramer.
All right, same order. Yeah, so in terms of digital marketing systems, the farmers that we were interviewing about their food security, a lot of them in Odisha did not have access to smartphones themselves. And so for them, getting increased access to food markets using digital platforms, I think wouldn't be the right strategy because of a lack of smartphone ownership. But what was really interesting is that in the example that I mentioned in Haryana with the government procurement of wheat, farmers could actually enter the markets and reserve slots for when they would come with their wheat to the markets using digital platforms, so they could in an app indicate when they wanted to come. So that was one way of organizing kind of the social distancing in these markets. So yeah, and then in Kenya, we're actually really using a lot of digital platforms, not so much on the food market side, but more on the input market side. And so all the booking of seeds that I mentioned, and so bundling seeds with insurance, all that work is done online, whereby a champion farmer in a community is trained on using a smartphone to then in an app, in a dedicated app, to go around in their community and inventorize from the farmers in their community which seeds they would want to buy. And then those seeds are ordered and delivered into the communities. And the enrollment in insurance is all done digitally. And even the implementation of the insurance product is done digitally, whereby smartphone images of the crops are used to settle claims. So a lot of digital work there. And there's creative ways of overcoming the lack of smartphone ownership in, for instance, our Kenya case.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Sharma.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a very important question. When we talk of technology, I think now we are moving to this 4IR world, right? The fourth industrial revolution. And there have been prospects of using these latest 4IR technologies in agriculture as well. But in Nepal, if you look at on the production side of things, not much actually is being used. Not many new technologies are being used. Yes, there have been changes, especially in the sense of like earlier farmers, they used to be actually price takers. So whatever, they even didn't know about the price. They would just take their produce to the market, and whatever price they would get, they would just sell it. But now, at least through the use of these mobile phones, through the use of the internet, they are able to know the price of the different produce in the market and accordingly make their decisions of where to sell, when to sell. So that is one way. The other one that we saw actually during the pandemic, the use of technology, was the rise of e-commerce, also to sell, vegetable, fresh products. But then over here, it's not the farmers themselves who are directly connected to these online platforms and selling their goods directly, right? They are doing this through the intermediaries, through those people who are into commerce. So the farmers will sell their produce to these people, and they would deliver through online means, and that actually became a very important source during the pandemic. But again, it was not the very small farmers who could make use of these opportunities, because they wouldn't have access to that and they wouldn't have the knowledge also. And this was a phenomenon that we especially saw in the urban areas for obvious reasons, not in the rural areas as such. So the pandemic did show that there are opportunities of using these technologies, but then for a country like Nepal, I think there is still a long way to go.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Dr. Ford, I think this question is relevant to your research area too.
Yeah. As I mentioned, we have been trying to use these kind of instruments very broadly to try to help to solve some problems. But as the previous colleagues mentioned, I think the key thing for the global South to understand the use of digital technology is to really understand the diagnostic of why it is difficult to use this type of technology in our cases, right? And we found, for example, that in many of the areas that we were trying to work, it's not that you don't have the technology is there and you can easily adapt, but there were some other small problems that you have to solve first. One of them was, even though most of the vendors, for example, in food markets had access to smartphones, they normally don't use it. They use it as a regular phone and not as a smartphone, right? So teaching them the advantages to use a very simple application like WhatsApp, for example, to try to coordinate sales with other food vendors and with consumers was key to start implementing new solutions, right? The digital money that we introduced in some markets was also very easy to monitor and to register. And that was a first step to then go to a second stage where you can introduce e-commerce platforms or sell platforms, right? And the second thing that we found very useful is that you need to build some trust on the technology, right? On the use of the technology and what it implies. Sometimes they don't trust the person that they don't see, right? So they don't see the banks that are the creators of the application for digital money, and they don't trust them. But if you work with the early adopters, with the guys in the markets that are the more risk takers or more into technology and start using it, and they prove that's a good instrument for them to work, then you can work with them to convince the other market vendors to use it more broadly, right? So that's what we're trying to focus now, how to gain trust in the use of these digital technologies to help other people around.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ford. Dr. Maria, what is your experience in this technological adoption and use of technology in this pandemic for food resilience?
Yo creo que este es un tema fundamental y que se ha hecho muy evidente en el contexto de la pandemia. En América Latina hay zonas importantes, rurales, como me imagino que también en otras regiones, que todavía no tienen acceso de calidad a conexiones digitales que hagan viable el posterior uso de las tecnologías. Pero además de eso, bueno, hemos visto inversiones importantes durante este tiempo en ese sentido, pero además de eso, como señalaba Ricardo, hay problemas severos como de alfabetización digital, o sea, de la capacidad del uso adecuado de las tecnologías cuando estas están disponibles y cuando además hay acceso a Internet, sea fijo, sea móvil, etc. Parte importante, yo creo, además de la dificultad, tiene que ver con un poco en la línea de lo que comentábamos antes, entre lo que espera la gente y lo que ofrecen los gobiernos, ¿no? Los gobiernos de la región en varios países han transformado o desarrollado plataformas importantes para la comercialización de productos agrícolas, productos artesanales, a través de, digamos, ferias digitales que reemplacen los mercados locales presenciales que no se pudieron llevar adelante. No obstante, los productores que tienen acceso a esos canales digitales son pocos, justamente por las razones que decíamos, porque tienen severas dificultades de uso de esas tecnologías. Nosotros hemos acompañado acá en Chile la experiencia de un programa, un piloto muy pequeño con mujeres productoras agrícolas en el país, que justamente consistió en, primero, darles teléfonos celulares, pero junto con eso un curso importante de capacitación en el uso, en el acceso a aplicaciones distintas, en el uso del teléfono y de sus potencialidades para efectos de comercialización, acceso a ferias virtuales, comercio online, etc. Recién estamos empezando a ver los resultados, pero al parecer son resultados bastante promisorios. Lo que pasa es que, claro, es una intervención costosa y de muy pequeña escala, no la de entregar teléfonos o digitalizar, pero sí la de alfabetización digital, digamos, porque requiere capacitación específica, extensa, sobre todo con los productores de mayor edad, que son parte importante de los productores. Así que ahí hay un trabajo importante por hacer, bien clave, sobre todo dado que vamos a seguir un poco, no sé si en pandemia, pero al menos con una alta penetración de las tecnologías digitales en materia de comercialización y de otras fases también de la cadena.
Thank you, Dr. Mary. Dr. Manoj, do you have anything to add on this? Dr. Manoj, I think you're mute.
So if I directly answer what Dr. Tusita asked, we are not utilizing the full potential of technology that is available, I think. But if I segregate the consumption and production market, in the consumption market, using of digital technology mushrooms during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially because of the frequent lockdowns. We actually experienced that in supermarkets, that they had a lot of surge in orders so that they couldn't supply, deliver the products one day. So they took a couple of days to supply. So it's like positive drive towards using digital technology in the consumption market, but it's only in the urban areas, urban and suburban areas. But when we look at the producers market, it's very rare that people are using digital technology to sell their products. That is one of the major drawback in the connectivity in the agricultural value chains. But I must say that there are certain initiatives by the different organizations like Govipala app to popularize these digital technologies among farmers, and they have some farmer database that about 2,000 or more than that. So it's kind of now getting popularized little by little, but we cannot forget that even though we have mobile penetration, high mobile penetration, the internet connectivity, network quality is very poor in Sri Lanka. So there are a lot of issues regard to the using digital technology, especially in this farming area. So I think we have to, because most of the farmers are very poor and they are small scale farmers. So there are certain challenges to popularize this. So in that front, I think we have some more work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj. To wrap up, I would like to ask a final question from you all. Most important thing is for the policymaker and the researchers is to make sure that we have equitable recovery from the pandemic. We are seeing a lot of policy initiatives by the policymakers around the world. Some are actually producer-oriented. I sometimes feel that we are ignoring the consumers aspect. So we need to find a balance between the farmers and the consumers, because there are urban poor, they are most vulnerable for these food related shocks. In this case, what do you think the role of the think tanks? How can we support to the stakeholders to design policies, evidence-informed policies, to make sure that there is an equitable recovery from this pandemic? I would like to start from Dr. Berber.
Okay, good. Yeah, so that's a good question. Maybe I can use this as an opportunity actually to make a plug for a journal where I'm the editor-in-chief for the social science section. I think there's a lot of interesting work going on in this area. And I think we're not documenting the lessons that we're learning enough. And I think as a think tank, you have an important role to play in disseminating that knowledge. And so when we're thinking about disseminating, I would also really like people I would like to invite people to send in their descriptions, papers, articles on what works to the journal Development Engineering, because this is exactly what we've been talking about today, is exactly the type of lessons learned that we would like to publish. And I think that could help think tanks then in helping spread that type of knowledge, because we can help with the peer review process, making sure that the findings are supported by evidence, so that the conclusions are supported. And so that's something I think that we could talk more about. I think journals can play an important role in here. And although Development Engineering is an open access journal, there are publication fees, open access publication fees, but for authors from developing countries, low and medium income countries, these are waived. So I definitely encourage everyone who is listening and has innovations and findings on, for instance, digital technologies or other innovations to keep food systems resilient in COVID times. Please do send in your work, and we can work with the think tanks on disseminating this knowledge and making sure it reaches the policymakers.
Thank you, Dr. Berber. I think the audience will be keen to use this chance, and thank you very much for sharing that information with us. It's really important. Thanks a lot. Dr. Sharma, to add to my question, what do you think about this trade policy bias towards producers? It is impacting the food security of consumers, and what is the role of think tanks to make a balanced approach to solve this crisis without favoring producers and at the expense of consumers?
Thank you, Asanka. I think that's a very good and important question. But if you look at from the Nepal's perspective, I think the bias over here is from the consumer perspective against the producers.
Okay.
Because we are a very food dependent country, we import, I think, almost like 15% of our rice and paddy we import from India. Mm-hmm. And because of the bilateral trade agreement that we have with India, based on which we provide reciprocal duty-free quota-free market access to primary agricultural products. And this has almost become like a cliche here in Nepal now, that Nepalese farmers are not able to compete with the subsidized Indian agriculture. And that has actually impacted Nepali producers, Nepali farmers. But Nepali consumers are benefiting out of the subsidized agriculture, perhaps. So In Nepal's case, it's different to what actually you are saying. But then, with whatever be the case, whether it's a bias against the producers or the consumers, definitely think tanks have a role to play over here, especially in terms of coming out with this evidence of finding the right balance of how do you make the right balance of protecting the producers and farmers as well, so that you have people there on the farms, but then also balancing the purchasing capacity and ensuring food security of people, especially the urban poor, as you rightly say. And during the pandemic, one lesson was also that there was difficulty in locating the urban poor. The government did come out with food distribution programs in the very beginning of the pandemic, but because of the difficulty, because of the problem with the database, we don't have a database of locating people who actually the vulnerable people are, who actually the rural poor are, and who are in need of this food support. The program couldn't go as anticipated and for long. So perhaps think tanks have a role to play over here to identify the gaps. What did the pandemic teach us? Where are the gaps that we need to fill, that we need to work on, so that if we are to face such pandemic again in the future, then I think we are ready in terms of tackling these problems. So I think think tanks definitely have these different roles to play in terms of those balance, as well as looking into the gaps and suggesting right policy basis.
Thank you very much for your insights, Dr. Sharma. Dr. Fort, what do you think the roles of the think tanks at this juncture to make sure that there will be an equitable recovery from this pandemic?
Yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Sharma, right? I think our role to create new information and new evidence based on that information of not only to identify the most vulnerable people, that is very important, but also to try to see what type of help or programs will work best in the context of the pandemic and the difficulties that we are confronting. Has been a key role for all institutions like us that try to create evidence to design better policies, right? This process has been a learning by doing process. So remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know even how the virus spread, right? So we were constantly in the need of getting new information to try to get ahead of the virus and try to restrict it, and also help to find some solutions, right? And not only in terms of the possibilities of contagion and the problem of the virus itself, but the policies that we did to try to contain it, right? The strict and long lockdowns has been a very detrimental way of dealing with the virus for the most vulnerable people, right? And even more in informal settings like the ones that we usually have in the global south. And that makes an extra difficulty to try to not only to contain the virus and its spread, but also to help people recover from the policies that we did or that we implemented to try to make that happen, right? So the role of think tanks in creating information and evidence for decision making has been probably more important than ever. Right?
Thank you, Dr. Fort. Dr. Maria, what do you think as the role of the think tanks to make sure we will have a quick but equitable recovery from the pandemic?
Sí, yo quisiera hacer, dos comentarios sobre este tema. El primero, creo ciertamente que hay un rol crítico importante en estar generando permanentemente evidencia, como han dicho quienes me han antecedido, para informar políticas públicas, gobierno. Y aquí mi comentario central es que yo no tengo tan claro, o sea, creo que este ciclo entre apoyo a la producción o dificultades más bien en el lado del consumo es algo que está permanentemente moviéndose en el tiempo y que por lo tanto es muy importante generar evidencia en ese sentido. Y pongo un ejemplo. Nosotros, bueno, tenemos evidencia de durante el año pasado, el primer año de la pandemia, que la producción alcanzó a ocurrir todavía sin altos costos en los insumos, etcétera. Hubo, para efectos de productos no perecibles como el maíz, por ejemplo, acopio importante respecto de grandes compradores de productos de esa naturaleza, por lo tanto, que lo que han permitido es que el abastecimiento de esos productos se mantenga en el tiempo hasta ahora. Pero lo que está pasando ahora es que a los productores en el fondo no les están comprando porque quienes hicieron, en el fondo, los grandes compradores tienen acopiado de la venta del año anterior. Entonces, lo que quiero decir con esto es que los ciclos, en el fondo, la temporalidad de los ciclos de producción y abastecimiento en términos de dónde van a estar los problemas no necesariamente tiene que ver con la temporalidad ni del virus, ni de los confinamientos, ni de los alzas de los precios, sino que con una serie de dinámicas que tenemos que estar permanentemente mirando. Y el segundo comentario que quería hacer es que ciertamente generar mucha evidencia, pero creo que también nos compete un rol muy clave en términos de apoyar sobre todo a los pequeños productores en sus posibilidades de acceder y de encontrar respuestas más pertinentes a sus demandas y a sus necesidades, sea en términos de vincularlos con gobiernos locales, sea en términos de generar algo que nosotros estamos haciendo fuertemente, espacios de diálogo entre estos productores y otros actores, porque muchas veces lo que vemos es que la asimetría de información, la asimetría de poder es tal que las posibilidades, incluso cuando están organizados, que tienen los pequeños productores de llegar a los procesos de toma de decisiones con sus demandas, son más bien escasas. Entonces, entre la evidencia que podemos generar y la capacidad de hacer ese vínculo, creo que también hay un rol importante, además del propiamente académico, en términos de ir apoyando en el día a día a los pequeños productores en la búsqueda de soluciones a los problemas que los afectan.
Thank you, Dr. Maria. Dr. Manoj, I would like to ask the same question. What would be the role of the think tanks, given your experience as a very, very well experienced researcher in this food systems and the food economics?
Yeah, I think think tank have a great role to play in the modern world, not like earlier. So the role of think tank is increasingly important in the present context. The popular belief or blame is to blame the politicians for not listening to the research or think tanks or things like that. Now it's not valid anymore because now the politicians are increasingly engaged with the people using social media and things like that. So, I mean, the think tank has to think about the way of transforming their research ideas and research outputs to the politicians, because traditionally what we did was we just do our research and then publish as a big book or something like that. But politicians or policymakers, they don't have enough time to refer all these things. So we have to understand the way that we transfer messages to politicians. So we have to find different ways like policy briefs or small infographics or things like that. And also we have to engage a lot with the social media dissemination and other dissemination sources. Also, I think networks, regional networks, we have like Southern Noise, ArtNet, and several networks that the think tanks can be a part of and do their research with a high quality and then disseminate their findings to a wider audiences, including the policy makers. So I think think tank has a greater role to play in terms of giving the evidence-based research to the policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj. I think it is the time to wrap up this session. We discussed the challenges and desirable policy responses to ensure food security and find solutions to make equitable recovery from the pandemic. I thank you all the researchers for bringing their insights, especially from the field-based research. It is really important to make these outputs available for evidence-informed decision-making for the policymakers. So I thank Dr. Berber Kramer, Dr. Puspa Sharma, Dr. Maria Gonzalez Gatica, Dr. Ricardo Fort, and Dr. Manoj Thibbotuwawa for spending time and bringing us these valuable insights. So I wrap up this session. I think based on your time zones, have a good day. Have a good rest of the day ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing and moderating. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.